Governor, the special session wrapped up last week. You described it as an epic failure. I'm not sure I over-dramatized with my inflection. Do you stand by that? What did you mean?
Well, the appropriations bill is House Bill 1. It's the first order of business. That's the budget. And they didn't adopt a budget. And it was an epic failure, not just because of the failure to adopt a budget, but the way that played out, where there was not even a vote in the House on a budget that got 36 votes in the Senate. 36 out of 39. In fact, there was only one no vote. It was 36-1. And I think that was an epic failure, the way that they ran the clock out and actually worked to prevent the House from voting on a budget we now know they wanted to adopt because there was a majority vote on a procedural motion to try to get the budget to the floor where it could be voted on. So that is an epic failure. We're back in a special session that should not have been necessary. We shouldn't be here right now, but we are. And, I had some productive meetings yesterday. I think there's a way forward where we can bridge the gap and do the people's business and get out in relatively short order. I'm hopeful. We'll just have to see how it plays out.
Representative Seabaugh was here last week, and he said that the House got you their version of the budget, or the Senate their version of the budget on May the 4th, and that the Senate didn't even bring it up till like 29 days later. He says that was purposely done. What do you think about that?
Well, you'd have to ask the Senate about that. But the one thing I know that the Senate did that the House didn't is they actually brought in every stakeholder, every agency head whose agencies were implicated in the budget and whether they were going to be cut and what priorities they had and that sort of thing, and heard from them. But the one thing I know is they got the budget back to the House in plenty of time for there to have been a concurrence, and even if it had to go to conference, which it did ultimately go to conference. I don't think it had to, but there were 3 days to work that out, and so I don't fault the Senate's timing in terms of being responsible for this. The timing issues were all on the House on the last day when they were just unable to bring it to a vote.
The special session, these bills are not revenue-raising measures. These are just pass the budget measures, correct?
Well, Erin, you're exactly right, and that's a point that seems to be lost on a lot of people. We came into this session, and if you look at inflation, if you look at mandated cost increases, if you look at what we try to do with K through 12 education, for example, on a continuation budget basis, we needed $400 million. That means $400 million more to provide the same services next year as we were providing in the current year. But zero revenue was raised. So there is an additional revenue in the budget. We're just trying to make the best available use of the available revenue. And, there's going to be big cuts, even under the Senate version, big cuts to the Department of Health, another 6% cut on average to our partner hospitals, including your hospital there in Shreveport. And we have to make that work, and we got to be very careful because ultimately the graduate medical education programs, such as in your medical school, those are supported primarily through those hospitals. There's cuts throughout the budget, but the one thing that people should be excited about, at least I believe, for the first time in a decade, the budget passed by the Senate had no year-to-year cut for higher education and fully funded TOPS. That was the first time in a decade, and that's stabilizing higher education is incredibly important. And as a result of that, the fee increase would be very modest as well. And in many cases, for institutions, there will be no increase on students whatsoever.
But let's talk about the fiscal cliff. You're going to call them back into special session. Governor, you have got to be hearing people saying that we feel taxed to death. How do you respond to that? Can we do more to cut state government spending?
Well, we can. And, Erin, one of the things that I would ask that you take into consideration, your listeners, is that since I've been governor, I've cut over $500 million of recurring expenditures out of our government.
But we still have the largest budget that we've ever had. Is that accurate?
Let me finish, though.
Okay.
I saved $200 million in the current year with the Medicaid expansion. I'm going to save $300 million next year. But the fiscal cliff is going to be there not because we need more revenue, but because revenue that we are currently getting evaporates. It falls off the books because the legislature chose to do that in a very temporary way. So we don't need to raise more revenue, but we have to replace what is going to fall off the books. We need to do it in a permanent way that adds to stability and predictability. But this was the fiscal session before the fiscal cliff, and the House never passed a single instrument, a single piece of legislation to address that cliff. And that is why we are going to have to come back into a special session, because we can't do it in the regular session next year because it doesn't allow for fiscal measures. The House didn't have a plan of its own. The House didn't adopt my plan. The House didn't go forward with any part of the task force recommendations, and so did absolutely nothing to address the cliff.
Without getting into so much detail that you'll just lose me because I'm not much of a math guy, what would make this special session in your mind an epic success?
Well, it's hard to say epic success when you do the basics, but we just have the money bills pending in the special session, the appropriations bill, the capital outlay bill, and the funding mechanism for capital outlay so that we can bond out and produce the revenue necessary to continue our construction projects. But we also have a supplemental appropriation bill, and that's very important because one thing that was totally ignored by the House in the regular session was the supplemental appropriations. We have $80 million of unpaid bills right now. If we don't pay those bills get rolled forward into next fiscal year, and they have to be paid first with money that wasn't appropriated for that purpose, and that is the surest way to blow a hole in next year's budget. The Senate actually found the $80 million to address those supplemental needs, and so they actually fixed over $100 million worth of problems that were left unaddressed completely by the House when you also take into consideration the downgrade in the revenue forecast that was accommodated in the Senate's version of the budget. So that's another reason why I think we should move forward with the Senate's proposal. Again, not that it's pretty. There's still cuts across state government, but let me tell you what didn't cut. Higher education didn't cut. TOPS isn't cut. It's fully funded. We're not cutting our veterans, our seniors, corrections, or DCFS. There's no cuts to K through 12 education, but there are cuts just about everywhere else.
The National Conference of State Legislatures issued a report showing the revenues raised by state. Louisiana is shown to have raised $1.5 billion last year. The next closest, South Dakota, $100 million. Why did we have to do that? And I know you're going to point to Bobby Jindal, but that's a lot of money we brought in. No state's even close, Governor.
Did you also read the report that they put out before that talked about the largest budget deficits in the country? There was a budget deficit at the same time that exceeded $2 billion. So we didn't replace all of that deficit in terms of new revenue. And much of what they're talking about, money being raised, were actually tax expenditures that were being lowered. I personally do not believe that it is new revenue or net increase in taxes if you stop your giveaways. And some of that was, and much of it, was in reduced giveaways to different activities through tax expenditures.
Do you anticipate we'll have to raise $1 billion next year? What do we have to do next year?
Well, see, I disagree with your terminology again. We don't have to raise a lot of net new revenue next year, and by the time we get back into special session, we'll have a better read on what the economy is doing, what the revenue estimations are, and those always change over time. We don't have to raise a lot of net new revenue, maybe none, but we have taxes that are coming in that are going to fall off the books, primarily that fifth penny. That's $880 million by itself, and it was put on 27 months, a temporary fashion, and it's going to fall off this time next year. So we have to replace it, but that's not net new revenue, and you know, I'm going to be working very hard with legislative leadership, with stakeholders around the state, to again come up with a plan to do that. One that makes sense and that will provide the stability and predictability that we want.